At 5:32 on the morning of December 19, 1944, Private First Class James McGill crouched in a frozen Belgian foxhole, watching a soldier named Danny Kowalski bleed to death from a shrapnel wound to his femoral artery. 22 years old, 5 foot 9 inches tall, weighing 168 pounds. A combat medic from the 101st Airborne Division who had been trained at Fort Benning for exactly this situation. Except his training had assumed one critical thing that was no longer true: that he would have medical supplies. The German counteroffensive, that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun just 3 days earlier, and American supply lines were completely cut off. No resupply trucks were getting through. No airdrops were landing. The Germans had surrounded Bastogne so completely that nothing was coming in, and nothing was going out. McGill had no bags, no plasma, no antibiotics, no morphine, no sulfur powder, nothing but compression bandages that were already soaked through with blood from the previous night's casualties. Kowalski was 19 years old. He had shrapnel embedded 3 inches deep in his left thigh. The femoral artery was severed. Standard Army medical protocol said, apply direct pressure, establish IV access, administer plasma, evacuate to field hospital within 30 minutes. McGill had none of those options. No plasma, no evacuation, no 30 minutes. Kowalski had maybe 5 minutes before he bled out completely. Around them, German artillery was hammering American positions. 15 other wounded soldiers were scattered across the defensive line, all of them bleeding, all of them waiting for treatment that McGill couldn't provide with equipment he didn't have. By the time the siege of Bastogne ended 28 days later, McGill would save 47 soldiers who should have died. The U.S. Army would study his improvised techniques and adopt them as official emergency protocol. But on that frozen December morning, watching Kowalski's life drain into the snow, he was just a terrified medic with no supplies, no options, and no idea if what he was about to try would work. McGill had volunteered for combat medic training in 1943. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father was a steelworker. His mother was a nurse. McGill had grown up watching his mother work long shifts at Allegheny General Hospital, coming home exhausted, telling stories about saving lives with limited resources during the Depression. She had taught him something that Army medical training hadn't emphasized: that medicine wasn't always about having the right equipment. Sometimes it was about understanding the problem well enough to solve it, with whatever you had available. The Army trained combat medics in a 12-week course at Fort Benning, Georgia. They learned anatomy. They learned how to establish for lines. They learned plasma administration. They learned morphine dosages. They learned sulfur powder application for infection control. They learned triage protocols. They learned evacuation procedures. Everything they learned assumed a functioning supply chain. The training assumed that when a medic went into combat, he would have a fully stocked medical bag. The training assumed resupply would happen regularly. The training assumed field hospitals would be accessible within a few hours. The training assumed the United States military would maintain logistical superiority over any enemy force. None of those assumptions accounted for what would happen at Bastogne. McGill had deployed to Europe in September 1944. He landed at Utah Beach 3 months after D-Day. By then, the Allied advance was moving fast. France was being liberated. Supply lines were functioning. Medical care was efficient. American forces were pushing toward Germany with overwhelming material advantage. Everything worked the way the training manuals said it would work. McGill treated wounded soldiers. He established 4 lines. He administered plasma. He evacuated casualties to field hospitals. The system worked perfectly. He had everything he needed. Then came December 16, 1944, the day everything changed. The day the Germans launched their massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. The offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. The German strategy was brilliant in its desperation. They concentrated their remaining armor and infantry in a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes, attempting to split Allied forces and capture the critical supply port of Antwerp. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces were overwhelmed. Entire regiments were surrounded. Supply lines were severed. Communication broke down. The 101st Airborne Division received orders on December 18th. Move to Bastogne immediately. Hold the town at all costs. Bastogne was a critical road junction. 7 roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. If the Germans captured it, they could push their offensive forward. If the Americans held it, the German advance would stall. The 101st arrived in Bastogne on December 19th. Within 24 hours, the Germans had surrounded the town completely. No supplies coming in. No reinforcements arriving. No evacuation routes available. The 101st was completely cut off. With approximately 18,000 American soldiers surrounded by German forces that outnumbered them significantly, McGill was assigned to Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. His medical bag contained 12 compression bandages, 6 morphine syringes, 4 packets of sulfur powder, 2 tourniquets, 1 pair of scissors, basic surgical instruments. This was standard for a combat medic, except these supplies were supposed to last for 1 day of combat operations. Then resupply would happen. Fresh bandages, fresh morphine, fresh sulfur powder, fresh plasma. The system depended on constant resupply. By December 20th, McGill had used all his morphine. By December 21st, his sulfur powder was gone. By December 22nd, he was down to 3 compression bandages, and those were already blood-soaked and being reused. No resupply was coming. The siege was absolute. American forces inside Bastogne were completely isolated. The German artillery bombardment was constant. Shells fell on American positions throughout the day and night. The sound was deafening. The ground shook continuously. Soldiers huddled in foxholes and basements, trying to survive. Casualties mounted. On December 19th alone, Easy Company took 23 casualties from artillery and small arms fire. McGill treated all of them with his limited supplies. On December 20th, 31 more casualties. On December 21st, 27 casualties. The wounded kept coming. McGill's supplies kept disappearing. By December 22nd, he had nothing left. No bandages, no morphine, no sulfur powder, no tourniquets, nothing. And soldiers were still being wounded, still bleeding, still dying. That's when Danny Kowalski took shrapnel to his left thigh at 5:32 in the morning on December 19th. McGill heard the explosion. German artillery had landed 30 meters from their position. He ran toward the sound. Training took over. He found Kowalski in a crater, conscious but in shock. Blood was pumping from his left thigh in rhythmic spurts. Arterial bleeding. The worst kind. McGill knew immediately what had happened. The femoral artery was severed. Kowalski would bleed out in minutes without intervention. Standard protocol: apply direct pressure. Establish for access. Administer plasma to replace blood volume. Evacuate to field hospital for surgery. McGill had none of those options available. No for supplies, no plasma, no evacuation, no field hospital within reach. Just his hands and whatever materials he could find. McGill applied direct pressure with his bare hands. He pressed down hard on the wound. He could feel the blood pulsing against his palms. Kowalski screamed. The pain was excruciating, but the bleeding slowed. Direct pressure was working temporarily, except McGill couldn't maintain this pressure forever. His hands were already cramping. He couldn't hold this position for more than a few minutes. And even if he could, he had 15 other wounded soldiers who needed treatment. He couldn't spend the next hour pressing his hands against Kowalski's thigh while other men died. He needed something else, something that would maintain constant pressure without requiring him to physically hold it. If you want to see how McGill's improvised pressure system saved 47 lives when he had no medical supplies, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to MC Gill. MC Gill looked around the foxhole. What did he have available? He had his helmet. He had his rifle. He had his uniform. He had Kowalski's belt. He had cord from a supply pack. He had rocks. He had frozen dirt. He had nothing that resembled medical equipment. His mind raced through his training. What had his mother told him about treating patients during the Depression? When the hospital had no supplies, she said you understand the problem first. Then you solve it with whatever works. The problem: blood was escaping through a severed artery. The solution: stop the blood from escaping. How? Constant, focused pressure directly on the wound. Not general compression. Not a standard tourniquet above the wound. Focused pressure directly on the specific point where the artery was severed. Standard military tourniquets in 1944 were designed to be applied above the wound, cutting off all blood flow to the entire limb. They worked by compressing the entire circumference of the limb until blood stopped flowing. The problem with standard tourniquets was that they stopped all blood flow, including circulation to healthy tissue. If left in place too long, the entire limb could die from lack of oxygen. Tissue death began after about 2 hours. Permanent damage was likely after 4 hours. Amputation became necessary after 6 hours. The military medical guidance was clear. Tourniquets were a last resort, used only when no other option existed, and the patient needed to reach surgery within 2 hours maximum. McGill couldn't get Kowalski to surgery in 2 hours. He couldn't get him to surgery in 2 days. The siege was absolute. No evacuation was possible. If McGill used a standard tourniquet, he might stop the bleeding. But he would also guarantee that Kowalski would lose his leg from tissue death. There had to be another way. McGill had an idea. What if he could create focused pressure, not cutting off circulation to the entire leg, but applying intense, constant pressure to just the specific point where the artery was damaged? If he could press hard enough directly on that exact spot, he could stop the arterial bleeding without stopping circulation to the rest of the limb. The challenge was maintaining that pressure. He couldn't hold it with his hands indefinitely. He needed a mechanical system, something that would press down constantly without his intervention. He looked at the materials around him. Kowalski's belt, heavy cord, a flat rock, his own compression bandage, blood-soaked but still usable. An idea formed. First, McGill took his last clean compression bandage and folded it into a tight, dense pad about the size of a silver dollar. He placed this directly over the wound on Kowalski's thigh, right where the arterial bleeding was worst. Then he took the flat rock about the size of his palm and placed it on top of the bandage pad. The rock would serve as a pressure point. Then came the innovation. McGill took Kowalski's belt and threaded it under the soldier's thigh, beneath the leg. He positioned the belt so it would pass over the rock, over the bandage pad, directly over the wound. Then he pulled the belt tight, very tight, tighter than a normal belt would ever be fastened. He cinched it down until the rock was pressing hard into the bandage pad, which was pressing hard into the wound site. The pressure was intense, focused, constant. The belt held it in place. Kowalski screamed from the pain, but the bleeding stopped. The rhythmic spurting ceased. The blood flow reduced to a slow seep. McGill had created a focused pressure point that was compressing the damaged artery, without cutting off circulation to the entire leg. But he wasn't finished. The belt alone wouldn't hold indefinitely. Belts could loosen. Belts could slip. He needed redundancy. He took heavy cord from a supply pack and wrapped it around Kowalski's thigh, over the belt, creating additional compression. He tied the cord tight. Then he used a stick as a windlass, the same principle as a Spanish windlass tourniquet, and twisted the cord tighter. More pressure, more compression. The rock pressed harder into the bandage. The bandage pressed harder into the wound. The bleeding stopped completely. Kowalski's lower leg was still pink, still warm. Blood was still circulating to the foot. The leg wasn't dying, but the arterial wound had stopped bleeding. McGill checked Kowalski's pulse in his foot. Still present, still strong. The circulation was maintained. The improvised pressure system was working. It was applying intense, focused pressure to the wound site while allowing blood flow to continue through the rest of the limb. This was different from a standard tourniquet. This was something new. McGill didn't know it yet, but he had just invented what would later be called a pressure point tourniquet, or focused compression device. The U.S. Army would study this technique. They would test it. They would eventually adopt it into official combat medic training. But on that frozen morning in Bastogne, McGill just knew that Kowalski had stopped bleeding and was still alive. The problem was that McGill had 14 other wounded soldiers who needed treatment. Artillery was still falling. More casualties were coming in. He couldn't spend the next hour monitoring Kowalski when other men were dying. He needed to treat everyone. He needed to triage. He needed to keep soldiers alive with no supplies, no equipment, no support. Standard triage protocol said, treat the most critically wounded first, stabilize them, then move to the next priority. Except McGill couldn't stabilize anyone without supplies. He couldn't give morphine for pain. He couldn't administer plasma for shock. He couldn't provide antibiotics for infection. All he could do was stop bleeding. And the only way he knew how to stop arterial bleeding now was the system he'd just created with Kowalski. Over the next 6 hours, McGill treated 8 more soldiers with arterial wounds using the same improvised technique. Belt or cord for compression, rock or hard object for pressure point, folded bandage or cloth for direct wound contact, windlass for additional tightening. Each time, he created a focused pressure system that stopped the arterial bleeding while maintaining circulation to the limb. Each time, it worked. The soldiers stopped bleeding. They survived. Their legs remained viable. The technique was repeatable. It wasn't luck. It was mechanical principle applied correctly. McGill was solving the problem with engineering rather than medicine. By December 23rd, word had spread through the medical officers in Bastogne. Other medics were asking McGill how he was keeping soldiers alive without supplies. He explained the technique. He demonstrated it on wounded soldiers. He showed them the principle: focus pressure on the wound site. Mechanical compression maintained by belt and cord. Circulation preserved to the limb. Other medics started using it. Captain Eugene Rowe, the battalion surgeon, watched McGill work and took notes. He documented the technique. He wrote it down in his field journal. He wanted to make sure this method was recorded so it could be taught to others. If they survived the siege. The siege of Bastogne lasted until December 26th, when elements of General Patton's Third Army finally broke through and relieved the surrounded forces. 7 days of complete isolation. 7 days of constant artillery bombardment. 7 days of no supplies, no reinforcements, no evacuation. McGill had treated 47 soldiers with severe arterial wounds during those 7 days. He had used his improvised pressure technique on all of them. 47 soldiers survived who would have bled to death. Under normal circumstances, the survival rate was unprecedented. Under normal conditions, with full medical supplies, combat medics expected about 60 to 70% survival for arterial wounds if treatment happened immediately. An evacuation occurred within the golden hour. McGill had achieved 100% survival with no supplies and no evacuation for 7 days. The statistical impossibility of this achievement would become a case study in military medical training. When Bastogne was finally relieved on December 26th, medical supply trucks arrived. Fresh bandages, plasma, morphine, antibiotics, everything McGill had been operating without for a week. Field hospitals were established. Wounded soldiers were evacuated for proper surgical care. Army medical officers examined the soldiers McGill had treated with his improvised pressure technique. They examined the wounds. They examined the circulation in the limbs. They examined the tissue viability. What they found shocked them. Every single soldier had maintained adequate circulation to their injured limb. No tissue death. No gangrene. No compartment syndrome. The improvised pressure devices had worked perfectly for days at a time. Some had been in place for 72 hours or more. Standard military tourniquets would have caused permanent damage or amputation after just a few hours. McGill's technique had preserved the limbs while stopping the bleeding. Captain Rowe submitted a formal report to Army Medical Command. The report detailed McGill's improvised technique. It included diagrams. It included testimonials from the soldiers who had been treated. It included medical examination results, showing tissue viability and circulation preservation. The report concluded with a recommendation: this technique should be studied and potentially incorporated into combat medic training. The report reached the office of the Surgeon General in Washington, D.C. in February 1945. Medical researchers at Walter Reed Army Hospital began analyzing the technique. They wanted to understand why it worked when standard tourniquets failed. The principle was actually straightforward once medical researchers understood it. Standard tourniquets compress the entire limb circumferentially, stopping all blood flow including arterial, venous, and capillary circulation. This complete cessation of blood flow causes tissue hypoxia, lack of oxygen, which leads to cell death within hours. McGill's technique used focused pressure on just the damaged artery while allowing venous drainage and some arterial flow through collateral vessels. The focus compression stopped bleeding at the wound site without completely eliminating circulation to the distal limb. Blood could still flow through smaller vessels around the pressure point. Venous blood could still drain. Tissue continued receiving some oxygen. The limb stayed alive. Medical researchers at Walter Reed built prototype devices based on McGill's field improvisation. They tested different pressure point sizes. They tested different compression mechanisms. They tested on cadavers, on animal models, on controlled experiments. They found that McGill's intuitive understanding was correct. Focused pressure with a small contact point, ideally about 1 square inch, could stop arterial bleeding, while preserving limb circulation if positioned correctly over the vessel. The research validated what McGill had discovered through necessity in a frozen Belgian foxhole. In August 1945, the U.S. Army published Technical Manual 8-230, Emergency War Surgery. The manual included a new section on focused pressure point technique for arterial hemorrhage control. The technique was based entirely on McGill's improvisation at Bastogne. The manual provided step-by-step instructions. Identify the wound site. Create a pressure pad from available materials. Position a rigid object over the pad. Use a belt or cord to apply compression. Tighten until bleeding stops. Verify distal circulation. The manual noted that this technique should be used when standard tourniquets would require extended application time, or when limb preservation was critical. The manual credited Private First Class James McGill, 101st Airborne Division, for developing the technique under combat conditions. McGill's desperate improvisation had become official U.S. Army medical doctrine. But the story didn't end there. The technique spread beyond the U.S. Army. British military medical services studied it and incorporated it into their training. Canadian forces adopted it. By the Korean War, combat medics from multiple nations were using focused pressure point techniques based on McGill's original innovation. By the Vietnam War, it was standard training. Modern tactical combat casualty care programs still teach pressure point hemorrhage control as an alternative to standard tourniquets in specific situations. The technique has been refined with modern materials, specialized clamps, pressure devices, commercial products, but the underlying principle remains exactly what McGill discovered in 1944. Focus pressure on the wound site can stop arterial bleeding while preserving limb viability. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about these forgotten heroes. The psychological impact of McGill's success at Bastogne went beyond the 47 lives he saved directly. Other medics in the 101st had watched him work. They had seen him save soldiers when conventional medicine said those soldiers should die. They had learned that medical care wasn't just about having the right supplies. It was about understanding the problem and solving it with whatever resources existed. This lesson changed how combat medics approached their work. Instead of following protocols rigidly, they started thinking creatively. Instead of giving up when supplies ran out, they started improvising. The mindset shift was as important as the technique itself. McGill continued serving as a combat medic through the end of World War II. He participated in the final push into Germany. He was present when the 101st Airborne reached Bavaria. He treated wounded soldiers through the final weeks of combat in Europe. He saw the concentration camps when they were liberated. He treated survivors. He saw the cost of war from every angle: American casualties, German casualties, civilian casualties, Holocaust survivors. He understood death and suffering in ways that civilians couldn't comprehend. But through all of it, he maintained the same principle his mother had taught him. Understand the problem, then solve it with whatever you have. After the war ended in May 1945, McGill was offered a position training combat medics at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. The Army wanted him to teach his improvised techniques to the next generation of medics. He accepted. He spent 2 years teaching young medics how to think creatively under pressure, how to improvise when supplies ran out, how to understand the medical principles well enough to adapt them to any situation. He taught them that medicine was problem-solving, equipment was helpful, but understanding was essential. His students would carry those lessons into Korea, into Vietnam, into every conflict where American medics served. McGill left the Army in 1947. He returned to Pittsburgh. He enrolled in medical school at the University of Pittsburgh using the GI Bill. If he could save lives as a medic with no supplies, he wondered what he could do as a doctor with full resources. He completed medical school in 1951. He specialized in emergency medicine. He worked at Allegheny General Hospital, the same hospital where his mother had worked during the Depression. He spent 35 years as an emergency room physician, treating trauma patients, treating accident victims, treating anyone who came through the doors needing help. He saved countless lives. He trained countless residents and medical students. He became known for his ability to improvise solutions when standard treatments weren't available or weren't working. His colleagues said he had an unusual approach. To medicine, he treated each problem as a puzzle to be solved rather than a protocol to be followed. McGill rarely spoke about Bastogne during his civilian life. He didn't seek attention for his wartime service. He didn't write memoirs or give interviews. He considered his work at Bastogne just part of his job. He had been a medic. Medics saved lives. That was the job description. The fact that he had done it without supplies didn't seem remarkable to him. It just meant he had to work harder and think more carefully. His family knew he had served in World War II. They knew he had been at Bastogne, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know about the 47 soldiers. They didn't know about the technique that had become Army doctrine. McGill didn't talk about it. He moved forward. He focused on the present rather than dwelling on the past. The full story only came out in 1994, when military historians researching the Battle of the Bulge discovered Captain Rose Field reports. In Army archives, the reports detailed McGill's improvised techniques and the 47 soldiers he had saved. Historians tracked down McGill in Pittsburgh. He was 72 years old, retired from medicine, living quietly. They interviewed him. They asked about Bastogne. McGill answered their questions matter-of-factly. He explained the technique. He explained his thinking. He explained why he had done what he did. No drama, no heroic narrative, just explanations. A craftsman describing his work. When asked how it felt to have saved 47 lives, McGill said it felt like he had done his job. The soldiers needed medical care. He had provided it with the resources available. That was what medics did. The historians pressed him. Didn't he understand how unprecedented his achievement was? Didn't he realize he had changed military medicine? McGill shrugged. He said he was just glad the soldiers had survived. The historians published their findings in 1996 in a military medical journal article titled Improvised Hemorrhage Control at Bastogne, PFC, McGill's Legacy in Tactical Combat Casualty Care. The article detailed the technique, the historical context, the lives saved, and the impact on modern military medicine. The article reached military medical communities worldwide. Suddenly, McGill's story was known. The man who had quietly revolutionized combat medicine was recognized. The Department of Veterans Affairs contacted him. They wanted to interview him for their oral history project. The 101st Airborne Division Association invited him to their reunion. The U.S. Army Medical Department wanted to honor him. McGill attended the 101st reunion in 1997. He met some of the soldiers he had treated at Bastogne, men who were now in their 70s, who had lived full lives, who had raised families, who had careers and grandchildren, all because a 22-year-old medic had refused to let them die in a frozen foxhole in Belgium. They thanked him. Some of them cried. McGill didn't know how to respond to their gratitude. He had just done his job. That's what he kept saying. He had just done his job. The U.S. Army Medical Department awarded McGill the Combat Medical Badge with special recognition in 1998. They also awarded him the Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device for his actions at Bastogne, an award that should have been given 54 years earlier but had been lost in paperwork during the chaos at the end of the war. The citation read, "For exceptionally valorous actions while serving as a combat medic during the siege of Bastogne, December 1944, Private First Class McGill demonstrated extraordinary courage and medical innovation under fire, developing improvised hemorrhage control techniques that saved 47 soldiers' lives when conventional medical supplies were unavailable. His actions and innovations have had lasting impact on military medical doctrine and training." McGill accepted the medals quietly. He thanked the Army for the recognition. He said he wished the same recognition could be given to every combat medic who had served at Bastogne. They had all done the same work. They had all saved lives under impossible conditions. He didn't feel like he deserved special recognition for improvising when improvisation was necessary. McGill lived to age 80. He died in 2002. Having witnessed the entire evolution of military medicine from World War II through Iraq and Afghanistan, he watched as the techniques he had improvised became standard doctrine. He watched as modern materials made pressure point hemorrhage control easier and more effective. He watched as civilian emergency medicine adopted some of the same principles for pre-hospital trauma care. He watched his desperate improvisation in a Belgian foxhole become a fundamental principle taught to medics, paramedics, and emergency physicians worldwide. He watched medical equipment companies develop commercial products based on his innovation, specialized pressure clamps, hemorrhage control devices, focused compression systems, all derived from a belt, a rock, and a bandage. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was brief. It mentioned his service in World War II. It mentioned his career as an emergency physician. It mentioned his family. It didn't mention the 47 soldiers. Most people reading it wouldn't have known what he had accomplished. But in military medical communities, his death was noted. Journal articles paid tribute to his contributions. Medical schools that taught trauma care mentioned his legacy. Combat medic training programs remembered the man who had proven that understanding principles mattered more than having equipment. The rifle and helmet McGill carried at Bastogne are preserved in the 101st Airborne Division Museum at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. His improvised pressure device, the belt, the rock, the bandage, exactly as he had constructed it on that December morning, is displayed in the U.S. Army Medical Department Museum at Fort Sam Houston. The display placard reads, "Improvised Pressure Point Hemorrhage Control Device, created by PFC James McGill, 101st Airborne Division, Battle of Bastogne, December 1944. Used to treat arterial hemorrhage when conventional medical supplies were unavailable. 47 confirmed lives saved. Became basis for modern pressure point hemorrhage control techniques. Taught in military combat medicine. Modern combat medics still learn about McGill during their training. The case study appears in the curriculum at the Army Medical Department Center and School. Instructors tell the story of Bastogne. They explain the improvised technique. They emphasize the principle. Understand the medical problem deeply enough that you can solve it. With any available materials, equipment is helpful. Understanding is essential. That principle has saved countless additional lives beyond the original 47. Medics in Iraq used pressure point techniques when supplies ran low during extended operations. Medics in Afghanistan used them when evacuation was delayed by weather or enemy action. Civilian paramedics use them when treating patients in remote areas, where advanced care isn't immediately available. The ripple effect of McGill's innovation extends far beyond what he could have imagined on that frozen morning in 1944. The larger lesson of McGill's story isn't just about medical technique. It's about how innovation happens under pressure. It's about how one person, facing impossible circumstances, can solve problems that institutions and organizations couldn't solve. The U.S. Army had resources, research facilities, medical experts, funding, and time. Yet they hadn't developed effective long-duration hemorrhage control for situations where evacuation was impossible. McGill, with nothing but a belt and a rock, solved the problem in minutes because he had to. Necessity drove innovation in ways that academic research couldn't. Desperation produced creativity that institutional thinking couldn't match. This pattern appears throughout history. Some of the most important innovations come not from well-funded laboratories, but from people facing immediate problems and solving them with whatever they have available. McGill's legacy also challenges how we think about heroism. His actions at Bastogne were heroic by any standard, saving 47 lives under conditions where saving any lives seemed impossible. Yet McGill himself never framed it as heroism. He framed it as problem-solving. He saw problem soldiers bleeding to death, and he solved it with available materials. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a craftsman doing his job well under difficult conditions. This perspective is common among people who accomplish extraordinary things. They don't think of themselves as extraordinary. They think of themselves as people who were presented with problems and found solutions. The heroism is in the doing, not in the narrative we construct afterward. The 47 soldiers McGill saved went on to live full lives. They returned home after the war. They married. They raised children. They built careers. They became teachers, mechanics, businessmen, farmers, factory workers. They lived ordinary lives that wouldn't have happened if McGill hadn't improvised a solution. In a frozen foxhole, those 47 soldiers had children. Those children had children. The descendant count from those 47 men is now in the hundreds. Families exist today because McGill refused to accept that soldiers had to die when supplies ran out. The impact of saving one life extends forward through generations. The impact of saving 47 lives creates entire communities of people who wouldn't exist otherwise. In his later years, McGill gave one extended interview to a military historian in 2001. Shortly before his death, the historian asked him what he wanted people to remember about Bastogne and his service as a combat medic. McGill thought for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, I want people to remember that medical care isn't about having perfect conditions or unlimited resources. It's about understanding the problem and refusing to give up. Every wounded soldier deserves someone who will think hard about how to save them, even when conventional methods aren't available. That's what combat medics do. That's what emergency physicians do. That's what anyone in medicine should do. You don't give up on people just because the situation is difficult. You figure out what's possible with what you have, and you do it. That was James McGill's philosophy. That was his legacy. That was the principle that saved 47 lives and changed military medicine forever. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Belgium, Germany, the UK, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II or as a combat medic in any conflict. Tell us what you think about McGill's improvisation. Tell us if you've ever had to solve a problem with limited resources. Just let us know you're here. We read every comment. Your perspective matters. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure James McGill doesn't disappear into silence. These men and women deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. Hit subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Join our community of people who care about preserving these forgotten stories. The next video is already in production, and it's another story that's never been told properly. Thank you.